All right, let's welcome in our guest to the Old Man and the Three Leadership Series, Bryan Stevenson. Bryan, thank you so much for joining us. It is an honor to have you on this show.
Thank you. It's good to be with you.
For those that don't know, you obviously have a best-selling book, Just Mercy. A film based on that memoir came out in 2019, also titled Just Mercy. And a lot of the film and the book itself focuses on your life story and the work you do with the Equal Justice Initiative. Could you just describe for our listeners that don't know what it is the Equal Justice Initiative does?
Sure. We're a private nonprofit organization. It started in the 80s, the late 80s. When I came out of law school, the critical issue that this country was facing was this tremendous increase in the number of people being sent to jails and prisons. The prison population throughout most of the 20th century was largely stable, flat, about 200,000 people in jails and prisons in the 1970s, early 70s. And then it spiked. We had this kind of commitment and this rhetoric, which has pushed the prison population from 200,000 in the early 70s to 2.2 million today. So now the United States has the highest rate of incarceration in the world. And so we created this organization to help respond to the critical legal needs of people who were in jails and prisons, many of whom wrongly convicted, unfairly sentenced, people on death row. And so I spent most of my time representing condemned prisoners, children sentenced to die in prison, people wrongfully convicted and unfairly sentenced. And that's been the work of EJI, providing legal services for 30 years. About 15 years ago, we broadened the mandate and began taking on the enormous challenges that we still have to face in this country around racial injustice. I didn't believe that we were making the progress we need to make. And so we took that on. And since that time, have become very active in advancing projects and programs that are designed to get our nation to commit to a different path, a new way of thinking about the legacy we've all inherited, which is a consequence of 2.5 centuries of slavery and a century of lynching and segregation and all of that.
My understanding with the sort of your response in founding the Equal Justice Initiative was in response to Congress eliminating funding for death row inmates to have legal representation. Do you remember the specifics of that sort of conversation that Congress is having and why they eliminated that funding to begin with?
Yeah, I mean, it's an important question because I don't think most people appreciate that, you have a right to counsel at trial. And then in some cases, you have a right to counsel on appeal. But after that, you don't have a right to a lawyer in this country. And so our system was producing a lot of convictions and sentences where there were really serious questions about the reliability of that. But the only way to challenge those convictions and sentences was to initiate what we call post-conviction filings. And there was no right to counsel. So you had hundreds of people on death row who were literally dying for legal assistance. They were sentenced to death. They were facing execution, couldn't get a lawyer. And so there were a handful of private nonprofits trying to meet those needs. And then in the late 80s, Congress funded organizations to provide some of those services. And it wasn't completely because they were concerned about people on death row. A lot of them just wanted to expedite the execution process. So when we opened our center in Alabama, we had some of those federal funds. It only lasted about 3 years before some members of Congress started saying no. And you may recall that 1994, 92 was kind of a watershed year. This is during the era with this sort of whole contract with America, and you had this kind of rising reaction against a lot of this effort that had been made to help people in the jails and prisons. The 90s were a terrible decade when it comes to criminal justice policy. Both politicians from both political parties were competing with each other over who could be the toughest on crime. And so when the idea emerged that we shouldn't be giving money to organizations to help people who are on death row emerged, there was support for that. And all of that money was taken away. And so states like my state, Alabama, which doesn't have a public defender system, you had people left on death row who had no mechanism for finding lawyers. And part of the reason why I argue that we have a criminal justice system in this country that treats you better if you're rich and guilty than if you're poor and innocent, is because there is no infrastructure for meeting the legal needs of people in jails and prisons. And so we have this 2.2 million population of incarcerated people, and no mechanisms, no institution for providing that. So when the federal dollars left, you're right, in the early 90s, we shifted to an entirely private human rights organization, and we just had to kind of struggle for a long time to find the money to represent the people that we were representing.
What was the initial feedback in terms of you guys finding this money, from donors? Was there an interest level from the jump, or did you find it challenging actually just getting dollars in the bank account?
It was always challenging. I mean, I came out of Harvard Law School, and my first salary was $14,000 a year, and you had a lot of people like me who had law school debts over $100,000, and it was always work that was driven by people who were mission oriented. Our annual budget was something like $300,000-$400,000. We were trying to meet the legal needs of over 100 people on death row. And we just kind of went at it with that mindset. And so for probably the first decade, we didn't have anywhere near the kind of support we needed, to get lawyers to come and work with us. They'd have to work for $20,000, $25,000 a year. They were turning down jobs at Wall Street law firms that were 10 times that. But there were a lot of people who cared deeply about these issues, and that was what we relied on to do the work, even more than the funding.
On this topic, I actually wrote down a few of your quotes from your famous TED Talk, but one of them, in reference to the criminal justice system, says, "Wealth, not culpability, shapes outcomes." What was your aha moment back in the 80s when you essentially found your life mission at a fairly young age and have continued that same mission now for over 30 years?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think a lot of it for me was just sort of the accident of law. Even though I'm a product of Brown versus Board of Education, and lawyers came into the community where I grew up to make it possible for me to go to school. I started my education in a colored school. Public schools weren't open to Black kids when I was a little boy, and lawyers came in, made them open up the schools. And I was really struck by the power these lawyers had to get the community to do something they would not choose to do. If you had an election in my county in the 60s on whether to end racial segregation, we would have lost because the county was 80% people who are white. But these lawyers had the power, and I liked that. So I ended up going to high school, going to college. But to be honest, I wasn't really thinking about any of that. I was a philosophy major in college, hadn't thought much about what came next, and I started looking into graduate programs and said, I'll just go to graduate school. And then I realized that, to pursue a graduate degree in history or English or political science, you need to know something about history, English, or political science. So I kept looking and actually found law almost by default. It was pretty clear to me, you don't need to know anything to go to law school. And so I signed up for that. But my time at Harvard was really pretty disorienting because it didn't seem like anybody was interested in talking about the problems of the poor or racial inequality. And so I was frustrated by that. And I actually left the law school and went to the School of Government to pursue a degree in public policy. Didn't find what I was looking for there. It just seemed like they were teaching people to maximize benefits and minimize costs. And my aha moment really came the next year when I was back at the law school, and I took a course that required me to spend a month with a human rights organization providing legal services to people on death row. This was a group in Atlanta, Georgia, which was then called the Southern Prisoners Defense Committee. And it was there that I met a group of lawyers whose lives were animated by the work they were doing. They got up early in the day. They were just really passionate about this. And they asked me to go see somebody on death row they hadn't had time to meet and just explain to him that he wasn't at risk of execution anytime in the next year. And so I went down to Jackson, Georgia to meet this condemned man. I was really nervous. I was just a law student. I didn't feel adequately prepared. And they took me back to the visitation room. I rehearsed exactly what I was going to say to him because I was so anxious about it. And then when they brought this man in, I was just completely blown away by all of the chains that he was holding. He had handcuffs on his wrist. He had a chain around his waist. He had shackles on his ankles. And it took them 10 minutes to unchain him. And by the time he was unchained, I was so rattled and so nervous. I just started saying, look, man, I'm sorry. I'm just a law student. I don't know anything about the death penalty. I don't know much about civil procedure or criminal procedure, or appellate procedure. But they sent me down here to tell you that you're not at risk of execution anytime in the next year. And when I said that, I never will forget that man said, wait, say that again. I said, you're not at risk of execution anytime in the next year. And then he said, wait, say that again. And I said, you're not at risk of execution anytime in the next year. And that's when this man grabbed my hands and he said, thank you. He said, you're the first person I've met in the 2 years I've been on death row who's not a death row prisoner or death row guard. He said, I've been talking to my wife and my kids, but I haven't let them come and visit because I was afraid I'd have an execution date. He said, now because of you, I'm going to see my wife. I'm going to see my kids. And I couldn't believe that even in my ignorance, I could have an impact on the quality of someone's life by just being present. And that man and I started talking. It turned out we had exactly the same birthday. We were the same age, same month, same day, same year. And he started asking me questions about my life. I asked him questions about his, and we just fell into this conversation. And I write in my book about how I just lost all track of time. You know, I was only supposed to be there for an hour, but we just kept talking. And I ended up in there for 3 hours. And then the guards came in. And they were angry that I'd stayed so long. And they were really violent with this man. They threw him against the wall. They pulled his arms back. They put the handcuffs back on his wrist. They wrapped the chain around his waist. They put the shackles on his ankles so tightly, I could see the metal pinching his skin. And I was just begging them to be gentler. I said, look, it's my fault. It's not his fault. I stayed too long. They ignored me. And then they started violently shoving this man toward the door. And it was really terrible. And what changed me was when they got that man near the door. I remember him planting his feet. And when they tried to push him through the door, he didn't go. And then he turned to me and he looked at me and he said, Bryan, don't worry about this. You just come back. And then he did something I was completely unprepared for. He closed his eyes, he threw his head back, and he actually started singing. And he started singing this hymn. He started singing, I'm pressing on the upward way, new heights I'm gaining every day, still praying as I'm onward bound. And then he said, Lord, plant my feet on higher ground. And the guard stopped. And then they recovered and started pushing him down the hallway. And I could hear the chains clanging as they pushed this man down the hallway, but I could also hear him singing about higher ground. And when I heard him sing, that's when everything changed for me. That's the moment that I knew I wanted to help condemned people get to higher ground. And I wanted to do it because I knew that my journey to higher ground was going to be tied to his journey. And when I got back to Harvard Law School, you couldn't get me out of the law school library. I needed to know everything about comity and federalism and procedure and all of the doctrine and jurisprudence necessary to help condemned people get to higher ground. And one of the reasons why I am such an advocate for proximity, for people getting close to the poor and the excluded and the neglected and the marginalized, leaving our comfortable spaces and going into uncomfortable spaces. The reason why I'm such an advocate for that is because when we are proximate to the condemned and the poor and the excluded and the marginalized, it's when we begin to understand our capacity to be agents of change. If people ask me now, how have you helped people? I say, if I've helped anybody during my career, it's not because I've been hardworking or not because I'm smart or anything like that. It's because I got proximate to a condemned man and heard him sing about higher ground and knew then that there was humanity and dignity that we had condemned that had to be recognized. And after that, it really sort of changed the course of my legal study. I found what I was looking for, on death row in Georgia.
The proximity piece is so interesting to me. And I read an interview you did with the New Yorker, and you talk about this a little bit in your TED Talk too. But it's easy to be distracted. It's easy to ignore, not necessarily intentionally, because I think most well-intentioned people, when they hear a story like that, would feel something. But it's easy to be in your safe space. And one of the things that you've done in your career beyond just represent people on death row is bring awareness and bring light to some of the atrocities that have happened in our country. And I just want to get a sense from you, because it seems like the idea of, let's say, white supremacy, while it has existed in my lifetime, I can't remember a time where it was talked about more, where it seemed like more of a threat than it does right now.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think you're right. I think, your question really gets at two really critical things. I think, first of all, in this country, we're not required to leave our comfortable spaces. It's very easy to create a life that's insulated from inequality and injustice. And the more you have, the more you can shield yourself. And we haven't created a culture that sees it as a problem, which is why we don't learn things that we need to learn. And I think with regard to questions of race, we have been taught in this country to be silent about our history, about the problems. No one gets a good education about slavery and the legacy of slavery. And I think that has made us all not free. I mean, I really do think whether you live in New Orleans or whether you live in New York City or whether you live in Sacramento, whether you live in Minneapolis, if you live in the United States, you live in a country where there is this pollution that has been created by our long history of racial injustice. There are toxins in the air created by centuries of racial hierarchy and bigotry and violence rooted in racism. And I don't think we're going to get free until we talk about these things that we haven't talked about before. And I think what encourages me about this moment is that people are waking up to the idea that we have to talk about some things. I think we have to talk about the fact that we live in a post-genocide society. I think what happened to indigenous people when Europeans came to this continent was a genocide. We killed millions of native people through famine and war and disease, and we've never acknowledged it. We kept their words, we kept their land, but we dispossessed the people and we slaughtered them. And we created a narrative of racial difference to justify that violence. We said, oh no, those native people, they are savages. And that rhetoric meant that we didn't have to apply these constitutional principles of equality and justice for all to that population. And once we embraced this narrative of racial difference, we set ourselves up for 2.5 centuries of slavery, where the great evil of American slavery wasn't the forced labor, it wasn't the involuntary servitude. The real evil of American slavery was the narrative we created to justify enslavement, because the enslavers didn't want to feel immoral or unchristian. So they created this narrative that Black people aren't as good as white people, that Black people are less evolved, Black people are less human, less capable, less worthy, less deserving. And that narrative shaped American society. And we never really contended with it. And we fought the Civil War, and the North won the Civil War, but the South won the narrative war, because that idea of racial hierarchy, of white supremacy, persisted. And one of the reasons why I've argued that slavery doesn't really end is that you look at the 13th Amendment that talks about ending involuntary servitude and forced labor, but says nothing about ending white supremacy. And because of that, I don't think slavery ends in 1865. I think it evolves. And we have a century of terrorism and violence where Black people are pulled out of their homes and beaten and drowned and lynched and tortured. And that happens because our courts step back, our public safety steps back, law enforcement steps back. It is lawlessness and terrorism. And because we haven't contended with that, that white supremacy persists, right? You have the whole demographic geography of this country shaped by terrorism. The Black people in Cleveland and Chicago and Detroit and Los Angeles and Oakland didn't go to those communities as immigrants looking for new economic opportunities. They went to those communities as refugees and exiles from terror in the American South. And because we haven't talked about it, we never contended with this presumption of dangerousness and guilt that gets assigned to Black and brown people. Even after the Civil Rights Movement, that persisted. And so today, we're still seeing manifestations of it. That's why police violence is so devastating in communities of color. That's why the manifestations of these symbols of white supremacy, the Confederate iconography and all this other stuff, is so devastating, because it reflects no awareness of what this legacy has done to us. And I just think for this nation to get where it needs to go, we're going to have to commit to kind of an era of truth-telling. And that's going to mean talking about these things we haven't talked about. And I just think, there's some other precedents for this. After apartheid, they committed to truth and reconciliation. I think Germany is an interesting case study, because you go to Germany and you can't go 200 meters without seeing markers and stones and symbols that have been placed next to the homes of Jewish families that were abducted. In Berlin, the Holocaust Memorial sits in the center of the city. And I find it striking that there are no Adolf Hitler statues in Germany. It would be unconscionable to propose honoring the architects and defenders of the Third Reich in Germany. But I live in a state, you live in a city, where the landscape is littered with the iconography of the Confederacy, where the architects and defenders of slavery, where the people who wanted white supremacy forever are honored and extolled. And that landscape is going to have to change. And so what encourages me about the moment is that I think more people are beginning to realize that the toxins created by this history are not going to disappear. We're going to have to do something. But what's discouraging about this moment is that some people are actually holding on to those narratives and embracing them with more intensity than they've ever done before.
I was going to follow up with that, Bryan. How does this equation change in your mind with the events of January 6th in particular, but just even, over the last year where there's to JJ's point, white supremacy has become so unavoidable for the average American who wants to, put their head under a pillow and pretend like none of this exists. It's one thing if they don't know what's going on in Mississippi or in Alabama or frankly in the prisons around the country. It's another thing if they don't know what's going on in the Capitol building when they're walking through the Capitol with a Confederate flag. So how does that change your mindset on this overall point?
Well, I think it just reinforces how we have all collectively failed. I think what happened at the Capitol on January 6th is a manifestation of decades of silence. Look, if you elect political leaders who begin demonizing people from Mexico and calling them criminals and begin demonizing people who are Muslim, if you begin using the rhetoric of fear and anger to govern, then you're going to see manifestations of that come out in new ways. And I think what you saw on January 6th is just an expression of how little we have done in this country to create a political environment, a cultural environment, a social environment that is committed to rejecting not just white supremacy, but racism and hierarchy and all of its manifestations. Those folks that went to the Capitol, not only did they have a Confederate flag, somebody brought 2x4s, built a scaffold, and hung a noose, this iconic symbol. And it just speaks to the absence of shame. It'd be like somebody going to Berlin and trying to build a little mini concentration camp and celebrating that as an expression of an idea that has value. And I just think that's the challenge that we face. But I don't think we can look to just those folks, right? It's a lot more people. Like most media have never acknowledged their role in sustaining lynchings. Newspapers all throughout the South, including in New Orleans, never have owned up to that. Banks and insurance companies and schools and universities all played a role. And so I think that's got to be the heart of the challenge, is whether we can get mainstream institutions to begin acknowledging this history and talking about it and responding to it in a new and different way.
Why is it so hard for America to talk about this? We haven't even gotten to the point where you said acknowledge, like we're not even close to the point where these mainstream institutions can acknowledge these things because we're in the first innings of the conversation, it feels like to me. Yeah. Until we can get buy-in from people and saying, okay, I understand where you're coming from. Let me hear more.
Well, I think you're right. And I think that the challenge that we face in this country on these kinds of issues is that there hasn't been a shift in power. So in South Africa, after apartheid collapses, a Black majority takes over. They have power to then shape what's going to happen next. In Rwanda, after the genocide, the people who were the victims of that violence, there's a military intervention and they regain power and they can shape what happens in response. The Germans lost the war. If the Germans hadn't lost the war, you wouldn't see that Holocaust Memorial in Berlin, right? And the challenge that we face in this country is that even though the North won the Civil War, the South won the narrative war. The South ultimately prevailed in maintaining, preserving white supremacy, and it spread. It was never really about equality. For some people, it was about enslavement, but it wasn't about equality. Many abolitionists were opposed to slavery, but they weren't in favor of racial equality. And so the struggle that we face in this country is that many of us are advocating for the kind of equality and the kind of justice that rejects in all of its forms racism and bigotry without the power that has typically been necessary to implement remedies in response to human rights violations. That's why Dr. King and the civil rights leaders had to resort to nonviolence. There's a power in nonviolence. It's a moral power. It's an incredible force, but it was the only power that was available to them. If Dr. King got guns and they went and tried to force people, it wouldn't have succeeded. And so the challenge that we face is that people have not been required because power insists that they respond to these issues. And so we've been practicing silence. And one of the things that means for me is that people who have power, who have platforms, who have an awareness, who believe in more justice, more equality, have to use those spaces to push these things. And I do think it's possible to do it. I mean, I look at where we've made progress on a lot of issues. Driving while intoxicated in the 70s, and it was not a big deal. And Mothers Against Drunk Driving created a narrative about the harm of allowing people to get in cars while they're intoxicated, and the law shifted. And we don't tolerate that the way we used to. Domestic violence. There was a time when if a woman called the police after being abused at home, there was no expectation the police were going to arrest her partner, her spouse. And then we started telling stories, and that narrative shifted. Even in athletics, what athletes face now if there's an accusation of domestic violence is very different than what it was 10 years ago. There are likely to be consequences that would not have been imposed even a decade ago. That's a narrative shift. I look at things around sexuality, marriage equality. All of these things have become achievable because narratives have shifted. Now what we have to do is to create an environment where people don't close their ears when someone starts talking about race. People don't look for exits when somebody starts talking about racial justice. And, what I'm trying to stress with people is that, look, I talk about slavery, I talk about lynching, I talk about segregation. We've built these cultural sites and museums. They're tough. They're challenging. They have to confront that. But my interest in talking about slavery and lynching and segregation is not because I want to punish America. I want to liberate us. I genuinely believe there is something that feels more like freedom, more like equality, and more like justice waiting for us. I really do. And I just think to get there, we're going to have to talk honestly about these things that we've been silent about. This country loves success. We love victory. We've got a whole songbook of songs we sing when we win, the Olympics and all that good stuff, got it all. But loss, defeat, when we make a mistake, we haven't found our words for apology. We haven't found our words for repentance and confession. And I think that's what we're going to have to build as we make this movement towards something that's more just.
Liberation from what? From guilt? What is the liberation from?
Yeah, liberation from the bondage of bigotry, right? I mean, you have a generation of people in this country who were taught by their parents, white people, that they're better than other people because they're white. And while it may seem to work for you, it's a lie. You are not better. You're not more evolved. You're not more anything just because of your skin color. And if you live a life distorted by that lie, you're not going to actually experience the freedom, the joy, the liberation that comes with recognizing your space in the human community. You're going to put up signs, and we have a museum. We've been looking at miscegenation, these statutes that limit love, right? So Black people get to the state of Maryland, 1633. Within 10 years, the state of Maryland creates laws that prohibit white people and Black people from marrying. You can't love that person, right? And we have a whole history of that. The United States Supreme Court didn't strike down bans on interracial marriage until 1967. States like my state of Alabama, the Constitution still prohibited interracial relationships until 2000. That wasn't that long, that was just 20 years ago. But it reflects the way in which we have gotten comfortable with this world where there are restrictions. I look at professional sports. Sports is another good space, didn't want Black athletes competing with white athletes. In fact, Alabama has a state constitution that still prohibits Black and white students from going to school together. It violates the state constitution. It's unenforceable. And then when some schools started saying, we're going to open up, we're going to embrace the liberation of academic environments unbound by racism and bigotry. And then those teams started winning, and those teams started preparing. And then the next thing you knew, people wanted to win more than they wanted to stay committed to that kind of segregation. And there was even a time, where you could have a black football team, but you couldn't have a black quarterback. And then people like Cam Newton come along and win a national championship. Now everything is open for discussion, right? And it just speaks to what happens when you break down the barriers. And so when I say liberation, I mean freedom from all of the constraints created by racism, by bigotry, by believing that someone can't be your peer, your friend, your neighbor, your doctor, your teammate, your supporter, your help because of their color. You go through life like that, and you're going to have a very narrow kind of life. And I've seen it manifest itself. I mean, hatred is a heavy burden to bear. And to justify the violence that we have seen in this country toward enslaved Black people, toward Black people who were lynched and terrorized, toward people who just wanted to vote, just wanted their rights, and yet they were battered and bloodied and beaten. To sustain that requires a kind of hate. And hate binds you, and hate will hold you down. And that's the liberation that I'm speaking to. I just think that you get to a place where you're no longer worried about the opportunities that are created when a person of color steps in the room. You get to a place that feels more open, that feels more like freedom, feels more like a healthy place.
I wanted to follow up with another narrative point. You made a parallel in the TED Talk that JJ referenced earlier about 1 in 10 people who have been executed on death row were innocent. And you said we would never get on an airplane, basically, if there was a 1 in 10 chance that the plane was going to crash, which I think everyone listening to the show or watching the show could agree with. How do we get that number through to people? Because I don't think, I have to say, it's an issue that I've followed. I read your books. I've followed, I'd say more than casually over the last, 5 or 6 years. And I had no idea until I watched the talk that there was that number.
I do think we have to, I think, again, our prison system and our criminal justice system has been so insulated from scrutiny. That's one of the challenges that we face. And, main reason why I wrote that book is to kind of get people closer. And even making a movie from the book wasn't something I was kind of eager to do, but I knew that it might get people closer. And I just think we have to get them to understand what it means to live in a nation where we tolerate that kind of error. And interestingly, I think I gave that talk in like 2012 or 2013. It's now 1 out of 9. For every 9 people we've executed, we've now identified 1 innocent person on death row. And it is just shocking. And I don't think, it would be hard to get people to understand that that's an unacceptable risk. If you said, 1 out of every 9 apples sold in a store, if you touch it, it will kill you. Nobody would touch an apple. Nobody would sell an apple. But we tolerate it in the death penalty context because it is distant. And I think telling the stories of clients, that was one of the reasons why I was, happy to have the movie get made. I have a client who spent 30 years on death row, Anthony Ray Hinton. He's now joined our staff. He goes around the country telling people about what happened to him. And I think you have to get people to understand the loss that we incur when we allow someone to be wrongly convicted or wrongly condemned or wrongly executed. And when that consciousness of loss grows, then our tolerance also changes. And I think that is part of what we have to experience.
I don't want to spend too much time on this topic, but I do want to ask you about the movie and how surreal it was to see some of your life's work on the big screen and have yourself played by, one of the we talk about Michael B. Jordan all the time, like one of the most talented actors of our generation.
Yeah. Well, it was great. I was, as I mentioned, not entirely sold on the idea of a movie because I've seen so many, movies made based on books and that were just really a disservice to the book. And I didn't want that to happen. I'd rather there be no movie than a bad movie. But when I met Michael B. and who was a producer as well as the star of the film, and he was so committed to doing it right. And then the other cast members were also really engaged. They spent a lot of time with me, and Dustin Daniel Creighton is a really talented director. My kind of hope increased. And I was very happy with the film, but it is surreal. There's no question about it. And Michael B. was so committed to doing everything as authentically as possible. He would be like, okay, how do you move in court? And how do you do this? And which hand do I put them? He was really focused on getting things right. And I just kept saying to him, I said, man, that's wonderful. I'm honored you'd want to do that. I said, but you don't have to be entirely authentic. I don't mind if you want to bring your Black Panther body role. I won't have any objections to that. No, but it was a real honor, and he was great. And Jamie Foxx, I did a great job. With my clients, I wanted to make sure that their lives, that the full humanity of these people I knew and cared about was presented. And Jamie did that with Walter McMillan. Rob Morgan did that with my client, Herbert Richardson, and O'Shea Jackson did that with Anthony. But that was important to me, and I thought they really delivered.
It was a great film. I'm glad it turned out into a great film and was not a bad film for you, for your sake. For your sake.
Too, that's right. I tease Destin, the director, all the time. He doesn't like this joke, but I used to say to him, I said, man, I got the T-shirts ready. T-shirt says, "Don't judge a book by the movie." And
I wanted to ask you how much of your time now is spent talking to, advocating to elected officials, whether it's locally elected officials or officials at the federal level. And the reason I ask is because you brought up these cultural shifts in the narrative around these institutions, whether it's domestic abuse, drunk driving, whatever it may be. And we are clearly in need of a cultural shift around the institution of policing, especially when it comes to poor and minority communities. So how much of that push to shift that culture is done by speaking with elected officials and really having conversations with them about what can be done and what policies can be implemented for progress?
Yeah, I'm definitely spending more time with those institutions. But, they are reflections of the larger society. They're going to vote the way they think their constituents need them to vote. And so I think we also have to spend time talking to the larger society. We built this museum and memorial because I just felt like it's tragic. It was, 21st century. We don't have a place where you can have an honest experience with the legacy of slavery or where you could learn anything about the era of lynching. And I just think the absence of that kind of space, you go to the Holocaust Museum, you didn't know anything before, you learn a lot. When you get to the end of that museum, you are motivated to say never again. Because we haven't created cultural institutions that motivate most Americans to say never again to racism and bigotry and white supremacy, we continue to see new manifestations. And so for me, it's been important to talk more broadly to a broader audience just than I used to. My first 20 years of my career, I was just in court. I was talking to judges and lawyers. I was trying to get the U.S. Supreme Court because if I could persuade 9 people to do the right thing, I didn't have to worry about all these other institutions. And we had some success doing that. But about 15 years ago, I realized that we probably couldn't win Brown versus Board of Education today. I don't know that today the court would do something that disruptive on behalf of a disfavored group. And that's when I knew we had to start talking more publicly. And so, yes, I am urging elected officials, both locally and nationally, to recognize that they have an obligation to do more, to elevate justice in this country, to think more boldly. I think we've been governed by the politics of fear and anger for a very long time. We said that in the 70s, what gave rise to over-incarceration was you had politicians saying people who are drug addicted and drug dependent are criminals. And we're going to use the criminal justice system to punish those people. What we should have said is that people dealing with addiction and dependency have a health problem. And we need the healthcare system to respond. And that healthcare narrative would have been so much more effective than that punishment narrative. But people were using fear and anger for power. And I think fear and anger are the essential ingredients of injustice and oppression. You go anywhere in the world where people are being abused and mistreated. If you ask the abusers why they do what they do, they can give you a narrative of fear and anger. And so we have to fight against that. And that's at the heart of my communication with policymakers is, to be bold, be courageous. Don't govern out of fear and anger. Don't govern in a way that reinforces people's worst expectations. I often, when I give speeches, I argue that you have to be hopeful if you want to create a just society. I think hopelessness is the enemy of justice. Injustice prevails where hopelessness persists. If you don't believe things can get better, if you don't believe that something is, you're not going to achieve it. And I just think that has to be part of the orientation that we share with our elected officials, and demand from them something more than this divided, contentious, bigoted community and society that we continue to see on display.
I was going to follow up with a version of this, with the body of work that the EGI has done, that you've done just sort of over the course of your career. I was sort of wondering, how do you not get frustrated at certain points, specifically about the ridiculousness and sort of the coarseness of a lot of our political rhetoric, and Trump is sort of the obvious example, but I mean, this transcends him. I mean, it's going on today and he's not president. It's politicians on Twitter, it's barking back and forth. It's, to your point, it's people on cable news and things like that. And, you're out here literally saving lives. And so how do you not see some of these things and sometimes want to just, give up?
I mean, it's a good question. I mean, I do think, it requires some discipline to keep doing the things that you think must be done, even when there's a lot of kind of shouting going on in the sides. And I guess I feel like I'm a product of a generation of people who had to do the very same thing. I've been in Montgomery here for a whole year with this pandemic, haven't been traveling, and I've been thinking more about the people in this community who came before me. And the generation who came before me did so much more with so much less. They didn't have the opportunities and the resources that I had, and yet they were committed to change, and they would put on their Sunday best, and they would go places to protest and ask for equality and the right to vote. And they knew that when they were on their knees praying, they were going to get battered and bloodied and beaten, but they went anyway. And there was so much noise around them, including from within the Black community. Some Black people were saying, y'all just making it worse for everybody else. And there was that noise, and white people were screaming and shouting. If you know anything about that era, there was a lot of noise that these folks had to just block out as they made their way to the spaces that represent freedom and progress. And I just am inspired by that. And I stand on the shoulders of those folks. And that just means that I can't be distracted by a lot of the things that are disheartening, that are frustrating, that are in the political atmosphere. And what I would urge other people is, to be listening for truth, be listening for the things that affirm humanity, and listening for, because when you listen at the things that are just about hate and conflict, and you get distracted by that. Your life becomes defined by that, shaped by that. And I just think that, that can destroy not only an individual, but a community, a state, a nation. And we've seen that happen before.
To follow up on Tommy's question, has there been a personal toll that your work has taken on you?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I've always believed that if, to go into the places where I go, if I'm going to help somebody on death row in a state like Alabama win freedom, if I'm going to help children who've been prosecuted as adults win freedom in a political environment like this, if we're going to have to fight against the powerful in the ways that we have to fight, as a person of color coming out of, Jim Crow segregation, to make a difference, I've always felt you have to be all in. And a lot of people in my profession would say, well, don't be all in. If you get all in, you're going to get hurt, you're going to get messed up. And I will tell people that the only way you can do the kind of things that we've been doing is to be all in. And that does mean that there are going to be tears. There's going to be days of real agony. You're going to get overwhelmed. I've stood next to people who were about to be executed in these surreal spaces and had to watch the hair shaved off of someone's body, and then watch them strapped into an electric chair where they were executed. And there is something injurious about that, right? There's something that happens to you when you have to witness that. I represent these children, and representing kids in adult jails and prisons. And I've, been in spaces where little kids are coming out of adult jails where they've been brutalized for days. And I've held these children while they've cried hysterically, telling me about the abuse that they have suffered. And then I've said to them, look, I'm going to get you out of here. And I had a little boy, 14 years old, who'd been in a jail for 3 nights. He'd been just horribly mistreated and abused and assaulted. And I told that little boy, I said, I'm going to get you out of here. And when I tried to leave, the little boy grabbed me by the arm. He said, please, please don't go. Please don't go. I said, look, man, it's all right. It's okay. You stay right here. I'm going to get you out of here. And I left that jail thinking, who is responsible for this? And the answer is we are. We've allowed our indifference to the plight of some children to make us silent as we've put thousands of kids in adult jails and prisons. We've got 13 states today that have no minimum age for trying children as adults. And I don't think a just society can say it cares about children by looking at how well it treats talented kids and gifted kids and privileged kids. Our commitment to children has to be expressed by how we treat poor kids, neglected kids. And so being in those spaces, being at Angola prison in Louisiana and seeing the legacy of that plantation system playing out in the lives of my clients, yeah, it will definitely get to you. But the upside is when you understand who you are in these spaces, when you understand what you can do, then you begin to appreciate how it's a journey. My great-grandfather was enslaved in Virginia, and he still learned to read while enslaved because he believed that one day there'd be freedom. And you think about a Black man in Virginia in the 1850s who had no reason to expect freedom, and yet he invested in this task of learning to read. He could have gotten sold for it, he could have been killed for it, but he did it anyway. And he would read the newspaper to formerly enslaved people after emancipation. And my grandmother would talk about how proud it made her that he had the ability to read and could keep people informed. And she wanted to learn to read. And she became a good reader and had 10 children. My mom, the youngest of her 10 kids, and she taught her to read. And that commitment, and we were poor, but my mom went into debt to buy the World Book Encyclopedia so we could see a world beyond the world we lived in. And I just think about what it took to do that and what it takes to do what I have to do. And I have no complaints. I have nothing I can complain about because however challenging my journey, it's been made less challenging because some old Black folks got on their knees and actually ended these restrictions on voting and ended these restrictions on educational opportunity. And people before them fought against these systems of terror and violence. And people before them found a way to love despite the cruelty and barbarity of enslavement. And I just think I have to honor them by pushing forward, even though it is overwhelming. It doesn't mean that you don't get overwhelmed, you do. But I've just come to appreciate that is part of the struggle. You're as an athlete, you understand, you can't be a great shooter without spending a lot of time, without pushing, without doing things that other people think are crazy. You've been in the gym hours after other people because you had a passion to do something. That struggle to be great, to overcome, is what's fueled that. Nobody gets to just say, oh, I'm great, but I didn't have to work hard or do anything hard. It just doesn't work like that. And I think justice is the same way. We've got to work at it. And when you're called to do it, you just feel like it's what you have to do, even when it's painful.
It's amazing. And your TED Talk was about identity and the way you're able to identify with the people that came before you, whether it was family members or activists, and use their legacy sort of as part of your own purpose. That to me, that's not a very common thing, to find that connection in your own identity with someone else, I think is truly fascinating. We've spent over 45 minutes chatting with you here, and we haven't even brought up the word leadership. And before we let you go, and I would just say the best leaders inspire by what they do, and your life is a testament to that. How would you personally describe leadership, and how would you describe the best leaders that you've seen?
I think what's critical for leadership is, one, a willingness to get proximate to the people you're trying to lead. That is, if you try to lead from a distance, if you think your status or your title entitles you to kind of separation and distance, I don't think you can be an effective leader. I mean, I really am committed to this concept of proximity, because I think without being proximate to the people you serve, to the people you're trying to lead, you lose not only the credibility and the integrity that you need, but you also lose the insight. You lose you hear things when you're proximate that you won't otherwise hear. You see things, and what you hear and see shapes your ability to be an effective leader. The second thing that I think is important for leadership is to recognize the narratives that are shaping, why people do what they do. Don't get distracted by just what people say and the things that people are repeating. Look underneath at the narratives. And if their narratives rooted in fear and anger, if their narratives rooted in bigotry, then you have to challenge that. That's what you have to change. That's what you have to work on. And that narrative assessment is really key. You've probably been on teams and you've seen this in sports, but the culture is just a culture of not caring about whether you win or lose. If you're going to be an effective leader, a new coach, a leader on that, you have to change that culture. You have to change the narrative that says it doesn't matter whether we succeed or not. It doesn't matter if we play hard or not. That's part of what I mean by narrative change. And then the third thing I think that leaders have to do is they have to be willing to believe things they haven't seen and to have that hope. I was taught that sometimes you have to stand up even when people say, sit down. I've been taught you have to speak even when people say, be quiet. And when that's part of your orientation, it just means that you will do things you might not otherwise do. And I do think leaders have to be willing to act from conviction and act in hope. And then the fourth thing for me around leadership is that I think leaders have to be willing to do things that are uncomfortable and inconvenient. And because we're human, we're biologically and psychologically programmed to do what's comfortable. We like comfort. But that means that we're going to have to make a choice to do the uncomfortable, right? We have to be thinking about whether this is what we have to do. And I think leadership requires it. I've never seen great outcomes as a result of effective leadership where nobody had to do anything uncomfortable or nobody had to do anything inconvenient. And for me, those are the hallmarks of effective leadership. And when you model that, I just think other people, are inspired, other people can embrace it. It doesn't mean that things always work out, but it does mean that there's a kind of character and integrity and energy to what you're doing that can make all the difference in the world.
Well, in my opinion, that was probably the best description of leadership that we've had. I particularly want to bring attention to your third point, which is optimism, which has served me well in my own life, in my profession, because you're naturally going to have ups and downs. But to be optimistic in what you do is incredibly admirable. And we can't thank you enough for coming on the show, for sharing some wisdom, for talking to us. This has been really informative and just incredibly purposeful. So thank you.
Oh, you're really welcome. It's my pleasure. Great to spend time with you.